USS Kidd is a Fletcher-class destroyer that was named in honor of Rear Admiral Isaac Campbell Kidd, Sr., who was the first American flag officer to die in World War II when he was killed aboard USS Arizona during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Kidd served with distinction throughout the latter half of the Pacific War and was one of the many picket station destroyers to be savagely hit by a kamikaze during the Okinawa campaign. Decommissioned shortly after the end of the Pacific War, she was reactivated in 1951 to serve in the Korean War. Today, she is berthed on the Mississippi River in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where she is preserved as a museum ship and is the only surviving U.S. destroyer still in her original World War II configuration. Kidd's keel was laid down on October 16, 1942, by the Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company of Kearney, New Jersey. She was sponsored by Mrs. Isaac C. Kidd, the widow of Rear Admiral Kidd, and launched on February 28, 1943. Kidd, like all Fletchers, had an overall length of 376 feet, a beam of almost 40 feet, and displaced just over 2,000 tons. She carried a main battery of 5.5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns that were mounted individually in 5 turrets along the center line of the ship. She had a super-firing pair forward and 3 more turrets aft of her second stack, along with 10 deck-mounted torpedo tubes arranged in a pair of quintuple mounts located amidships. These fired the 21-inch Mark 15 torpedo. Her anti-submarine weapons included 2 depth charge racks on her stern and 6 K-guns, 3 of which were located on each broadside amidships. For air defense, Kidd was initially equipped with 10 40mm Bofors guns, arranged in 5 twin mounts and 7 single-mounted 20mm Oerlikon autocannons. Kidd was powered by 4 oil-fired boilers, which generated steam for her 2-geared steam turbines. She was rated for 60,000 shaft horsepower and could make a brisk 35 knots. She had a cruising range of 6,500 nautical miles at 15 knots, and was manned by 329 officers and enlisted men. Kidd was commissioned into the fleet on April 23, 1943. During her initial cruise over to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the destroyer moved across New York Harbor flying the skull and crossbones of the Jolly Roger high from her foremast. The crew quickly adopted the pirate Captain Kidd as their mascot and hired a local artist to paint the famed Buccaneer's image high on the forward smokestack. Not wishing to dishonor Rear Admiral Kidd, however, the crew obtained permission from Mrs. Kidd first, and on the crew's behalf, Mrs. Kidd obtained official permission from the Navy for them to paint the pirate on the stack and fly the Jolly Roger. Kidd became the only vessel in the history of the United States Navy to ever be granted permission to fly the flag of piracy, at least until the Spruance-class destroyer Kidd and the current USS Kidd, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, were granted the same rights upon their respective commissionings. Both ships were also named in honor of Rear Admiral Kidd. Kidd commenced her shakedown cruise at Casco Bay, Maine, and her first duty was covering the North Atlantic sea lanes near Argentia, Newfoundland. She then escorted several new carriers during their shakedown cruises from Norfolk to Trinidad, before departing for the Pacific in August 1943 as one of the escorts for the new fast battleships Alabama and South Dakota. During a simulated torpedo attack in September, Kidd was struck by 2 star shells fired by the battleship North Carolina. As fortune had it, her forward damage control party was exercising in the immediate vicinity with a make-believe casualty strapped into a stretcher. One of the shells entered the compartment and crossed just above the chest of the pretended casualty. The sailor suffered a minor abrasion, which prompted Kidd's skipper to report to the task force commander. "Kidd claims to be the best prepared ship in the Navy. We had a victim already strapped in the stretcher when he was wounded." Her first job upon her arrival in the Pacific was screening the fleet's valuable aircraft carriers as they launched airstrikes on Wake Island in early October 1943, and again in early November for strikes against Rabaul and Bougainville. During the attack on Rabaul, Kidd stopped to pick up the crew of a downed plane from the carrier Essex, falling behind her task force in the process. She was promptly attacked by a group of 8 Japanese dive bombers and continued rescue operations while maneuvering to avoid bombs. The aircrew was recovered, and 3 enemy planes were brought down in the process. It was at this point in her career that Kidd picked up the nickname that would become her trademark. Taking their mascot pirate to heart, crew members began to ask for ransom for the return of rescued pilots. The ransom that they coveted was ice cream and other delicacies of the like that their comrades aboard aircraft carriers generally had that weren't available to most tin cans. Her reputation from this grew, and she became known as the Pirate of the Pacific. Other destroyer crews conducted this practice as well, but Kidd did so with a certain flair. Kidd eventually became one of the first destroyers to have her very own ice cream machine, which was something usually reserved for the larger vessels of the fleet, such as battleships and carriers. Kidd next participated in the invasion of Tarawa Atoll in mid-November. On November 24th, she left her station in the task force to investigate a submarine contact. While her sonar crews were working to verify the contact, lookouts spotted 15 low-flying Japanese torpedo bombers. Kidd urgently communicated the threat to the rest of the fleet, and then opened fire. She brought down 2 of the attackers, and the combat air patrol downed the remaining Japanese aircraft. She next saw action in the Marshall Islands in January of 1944, where she followed minesweepers into the lagoon at Majuro to protect them while they did their work. She participated in the bombardments of Roy and Kochi during early February, then guarded the construction of airfields at Emerau from mid-March through mid-April. Kidd then supported efforts around Hollandia in New Guinea through the middle of May, before supporting the invasion of Saipan in June and bombarding Guam in July and August. During this period, she was credited with rescuing a total of 35 downed pilots and air crews. In desperate need of repairs and rest for her crew, Kidd returned to Pearl Harbor at the end of August 1944. She returned to the fleet just before the invasion of the Philippines began, and entered Leyte Gulf on October 20th to screen the initial landings and provide fire support as needed until November 14th, when she retired to New Guinea. Kidd departed the combat zone on December 9th and headed to the Mare Island Navy Yard for a major overhaul and refit. Upon the completion of her overhaul, which included the removal of her forward torpedo launcher in favor of additional anti-aircraft guns, Kidd got underway again for the Western Pacific on February 19, 1945. She joined Task Group 58.3 of the Fast Carrier Task Force soon after her arrival and began preparing for the invasion of Okinawa. Her task group also made several carrier strikes on the Japanese home islands in March during the run-up to the invasion. On March 19th, the carrier Franklin was hit by a bomb, which resulted in gasoline and ammunition explosions that claimed 724 lives. Kidd was one of several destroyers which stood guard for the beleaguered carrier, while her crew fought to keep her afloat. In early April, during the early days of the Okinawa campaign, Kidd performed a variety of tasks. She screened battleships and carriers, provided fire support, rescued downed pilots, and even sunk a few floating mines. But her most harrowing job of all by far, and indeed the same rang true for any destroyer when its turn came, was operating at the forward radar picket stations that surrounded Okinawa and the Fast Carrier Task Force. Kidd was assigned to picket duty on April 11th with her division mates, Black, Bullard, and Chauncey. The raids that developed that morning weren't out of the ordinary based on the previous week or so. The first 2 were driven off mostly by the combat air patrol, but at 2:09, Kidd's crew observed one of the enemy planes descending rapidly before leveling out while making a run on Black, who was 1,500 yards off Kidd's starboard beam. But instead of hitting Black, the pilot pulled up and passed directly over her. Kidd's 20mm and 40mm gunners immediately opened up and scored several hits, but to no avail. Left full rudder was applied, and as the ship begun to turn, the lone suicide bomber crashed into her starboard side, just aft of the captain's stateroom. The plane hit just below the main deck, in the vicinity of the forward fire room. Her boilers were ruptured and every man in the compartment was killed. The bomb the Kamikaze was carrying was catapulted through the ship and out the other side where it detonated a few seconds later. Shrapnel from the blast decimated the forward 40mm gun crews, ripped through the Combat Information Center, Radio Central, the bridge, and the Mark 37 gun director. It also set off secondary explosions in the oxygen and acetylene bottles stored portside. 38 men in all were killed, and another 55 were wounded. Among those seriously wounded in the attack were the ship's commander, Harry G. Moore, and the ship's doctor, Dr. B.C. Garrett, Jr. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Junior Grade George P. Grieshaber was among those killed in the forward boiler room. In spite of being injured himself, Executive Officer Lieutenant Burdick Britton took command of the beleaguered ship. With her forward fire room out of commission, Kidd was dead in the water. Black smoke poured from her side, which served as a beacon for other Japanese planes, which made their way to her and attempted to finish her off. Her gun crews fought off repeated attacks, while her squadron mates circled their sister and provided covering fire. Steam was transferred to both engine rooms from her one remaining boiler, and about an hour later, Kidd was making 20 knots as she headed south out of the combat zone toward Ulithi Atoll, screened by another destroyer. A doctor from the destroyer Hale was transferred over by Highline to care for the wounded, and the crew buried their shipmates at sea the next day. Temporary repairs were made over the next 2 weeks, and she departed on April 30th for the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco for repairs. While in the yard, the Pirate, which had been ordered painted over in late '44, was restored to the No. 1 stack. Fully repaired and ready for action, Kidd was on her way to Pearl Harbor when the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. She was promptly sent to San Diego, where she was decommissioned on December 10, 1946, placed in the Pacific Reserve Fleet. Kidd was recommissioned on March 28, 1951, to help combat communist aggression on the Korean Peninsula. She once again made her way to the waters of the Western Pacific, where she arrived in July 1951. Kidd was initially assigned to the Fast Carrier Task Force, Task Force 77, but was dispatched to bombard targets of opportunity on the eastern coastline of Korea from Nando Island southward to Kansong. Detached from bombardment duty, Kidd was ordered to once again join a carrier task force traversing Korea's western coast. She then joined the battleship New Jersey on bombardment duty before being assigned to patrol the Formosa Strait. In January 1952, she returned to San Diego for repairs and an overhaul. Kidd returned to Korean waters in September, and the following month, she participated in a mock invasion near Kojo. She returned to bombardment duty soon after and rescued downed pilots along the coast. During Operation War Dance in December 1952, Kidd cruised at 10 knots around the harbor at Wonsan, drawing the fire of enemy shore batteries in order to reveal their positions. She returned fire and silenced several batteries successfully. The destroyer departed the Far East for San Diego and an overhaul in March of 1953. While off Long Beach Harbor, Kidd was struck by the 9,000-ton Swedish freighter Hainan on April 21, 1953. The freighter's bow sliced nearly halfway through the destroyer's hull and left a 15-foot V-shaped hole that extended 3 feet below the waterline, which flooded the sonar compartment. With no injuries to her crew, the damage was repaired and the ship was underway again in May 1953. From late 1953 to late 1959, Kidd alternated between Westpac cruises and operations off the U.S. West Coast. She made stops at Pearl Harbor and other various ports in Japan, Okinawa, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. She also visited Sydney, Australia, in March 1958, and later that year patrolled the Formosa Strait. Not all of the latter 1950s involved Cold War tensions for the destroyer, though. In September 1957, she participated in the filming of the motion picture Run, Silent, Run Deep off the coast of San Diego. Kidd was transferred to the East Coast and arrived in Philadelphia on January 25, 1960. From there, she made Naval Reserve training cruises to various East Coast ports. She joined fleet operating forces during the Berlin Crisis in 1961. December 1961 found Kidd patrolling off the Dominican Republic in a show of force patrol to provide an element of security in the troubled Caribbean. In 1962, she was assigned to the Naval Destroyer School at Newport before being decommissioned on June 19, 1964. She was subsequently assigned to the Atlantic Reserve Fleet at Philadelphia. Kidd was stricken in 1974, and in 1982 she was towed from Philadelphia to Baton Rouge, where she was transferred to the Louisiana Naval War Memorial Commission. She is now open to the public as a museum vessel. Kidd is the only Fletcher-class museum ship to retain its World War II appearance, as she was never modernized and has been fully restored to her August 1945 configuration and armament, culminating on July 3, 1997, when her torpedo tubes were reloaded. Kidd's special mooring in the Mississippi River is designed to cope with the annual change in river depth, which can be up to 40 feet. Half the year she floats as the river rises. The other half, she sits on keel blocks, and her entire hull can be visible when the water is at its low point. On April 25, 2024, Kidd began her journey to a shipyard in Houma, Louisiana. She is currently undergoing repairs and will be returned to Baton Rouge sometime in the spring of 2025. Kidd earned 8 battle stars for her World War II service and 4 for her service in Korea. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe so that we can bring you more content like this.